On the way.
Well, these probably are the two most important Stearman in my life, because this is the first one I ever flew in all those years ago, and the one behind me is the first one I ever rebuilt. Well, my background was, as a kid, I was an avid aeroplane spotter and photographer. So photography was sort of beginning to eat into my life, and I became a professional photographer and ended up flying in all kinds of different sorts of aeroplanes, as we do, flying around the world and whatever. And I went to an air show in Florida in 1900 and frozen to death, and two of these taxied by with two long-haired hippies flying them, no helmets, in the heat of the Florida sunshine, looked gorgeous, and I thought, what are they? Months later, when I got home, a guy started rebuilding these in a nearby airfield at Old Buckingham, and I thought, well, I must go and have a look and take some pictures. Next thing, I was offered a ride in it. Well, smitten I was, and it's just an unbelievable experience with your head in the clouds and flying around in this noisy old radial engine, but beautiful. And at some point I thought, well, I'd really like to own one of those, but it's an impossibility. They're hugely expensive, or seem to be at the time, and they still are. But later the same guy offered me a project one of these, which was just a pile of bits of broken aeroplane and whatever. And I thought, well, I've been rebuilding motor cars, it can't be that much different, can it? So I ended up buying this project, which took me about a year to just go through the nuts and bolts and brackets and whatever to see whether I got all the parts available, going through pages of maintenance manuals and parts books and all that kind of stuff. And eventually I thought, well, I think it's a go. And I got a wing kit from America, which was all the wood you could need to build the wings. All the ribs are made, the spars are made, and I needed someone to glue that together. Happened to have come across a guy that flies from this airfield who was a wood specialist for aeroplanes. So I just threw the whole lot at him and said, build me the wings, which he did. And then, of course, fabricking, you've got to do all that. Never done any of that before. So you got miles and miles of fabric and glue and dopes and all this kind of stuff. And eventually it sort of started to come together.
The PT Stearman primary trainer was a rugged biplane. Wooden wings, tubular steel fuselage, covered with fabric, rather like its predecessors of World War I. It harks back in its own way to the early days of aviation. Flying at that time was only 3 decades or so old. The Wright brothers had first flown 1903, and very quickly they identified the need to train pilots. So the Wright brothers founded the first flying school, one in America, then one in France later on. Elsewhere around the world, other pioneer aviators were realizing the same thing, that you needed to train airmen. That led to trainer aircraft. And in the legacy of trainer aircraft, this one has to stand out as one of the key machines, because it trained thousands of pilots. It's a big, robust biplane, able to take the sort of punishment that the tyro aviator would give the thing as he made yet another attempt to try and land. They built something over 8,000 of them, more if you count the number of spare parts that were produced that could make up additional aircraft. And they served in many countries. They served with the Americans, they served elsewhere during World War II. But it was in the US Navy and the US Army Air Force, or Army Air Corps in earlier days, that the Stearman really became the stuff of legends.
These aeroplanes flew millions of hours in America training our guys to fly the Second World War fighters, bombers, whatever kind of aeroplanes, both for the Navy, both for the American Air Force, both for the British Air Force, the RAF. RAF guys used to go to the States and train on these things. So they've got a history offshore more than in the UK, because there were none here during the Second World War, but the guys that flew here in the Second World War had probably all flown Stearman.
Well, before America entered the war, discussions had taken place with the British, and the British were invited to set up training airfields in America, run by American civilian companies. One of the great advantages out there was the sheer size of America. Its vast spaces allowed aerodromes to be established where pilots could learn and train with wide open areas, more space to crash in, some might have said, but at least they would fly in peace. You didn't have the risk of intruding aircraft shooting you down as you learned to stumble about the heavens. Over there, California, the Midwestern states, plenty of good weather, not like England. And the American people welcomed the young cadets from Great Britain. They took them to their hearts very much indeed, and memories became fond between the two countries. It helped set the situation for the future as RAF airmen trained over there.
Most of the Stearman produced for the training role were painted blue and yellow, bright colours, so they could be seen in the air, because training fields in America might have had 50 or 60 aeroplanes in the air at a time, so they wanted to be very visible. But towards the end of the war, that they were cracking up so many of these Stearmans in training, maybe up to 10 were wrecked a day on some of these training fields, that it became a nightmare for them to keep the blue and yellow paint jobs going, because they'd replace a wing off a bent aeroplane and it would come back doped silver, as all aeroplanes have to be painted with silver dope. So what happened was you ended up with aeroplanes flying around with yellow wings, rudder maybe silver, and it was beginning to get a bit of a mess. So it was decided towards the end, leave them silver, paint them silver. That year there was the Popular Flying Association had their 50th anniversary flying at Cranfield, and something like 1,000 aeroplanes turns up over the weekend. Having put a ticket on it for judging, I thought, well, no, never built an aeroplane, never going to get anywhere. I was surprised to learn that I'd actually won something. And I hadn't won any of the normal category of tickets free, but because it was the 50th anniversary of the PFA rally, they awarded a special prize for that year, and I had won the gong for the best professionally rebuilt classic aeroplane. Now, I was gobsmacked, as you can imagine, but there we go. After that, of course, anybody with a Stearman in the country used to come to me and say, where do I get this? How do I fix that? And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. And it developed and developed. And we came across another old airframe and we rebuilt that one. And we became kind of well known for that. So anybody within the UK and even in Europe used to come over and sort of say, can you fix this one? Or have you got another one? Can you find me one? And all this kind of stuff. So it sort of ballooned from there. So we kind of figure that we're one of the more well-known Stearman restorers in this part of the world. And yeah, over the years we've accumulated lots and lots of spare bits and parts, airworthy or not. But at the end of the day, we still end up with this huge store of parts, and it seemed an awful waste to just sort of leave them languishing there. And they were not bits you could use in active aeroplanes. So what we've done is we've presented Flixton Air Museum in Norfolk with a huge amount of Stearman parts and said, get on with it, build yourself a replica. It's taken them a long time. We still have bits missing, which we hope to come across to give to them so they can finish it off. But I think it's going to get to looking quite like a respectable Stearman, although never will be airworthy. My Stearman was ordered in 1941, probably delivered in 1942, but they'd been making Stearman for a year or two before that, and the design goes kind of way back, and it started off in the late 30s, but ended up when the Army Air Corps ordered these, that Boeing had bought out Stearman as a company. When Boeing produced the Stearman for the services. They made them in several different models, and the biggest difference mostly was the engines. So some had Lycoming made engines, these are Continental engines. There was another one called a Jacob. So they got different numbers for the airframes, and this is an N2S3 naval aeroplane N2S3. That was the type. They had N2S1s, 2s, 3s and 4s and 5s, which is confusing. Then in the Army, they call them PT-27s. Well, an N2S3 and a PT-27, identical aeroplanes, but one was Navy, one was Army Air Force. Well, this is the latest Stearman rebuilt. It's got all the paperwork signed, ready to roll. It's had an engine run or two. A test flight is always the most nerve-wracking thing you could ever experience. You've gone through every nut and bolt, every split pin, all the paperwork, engines, everything you could think of, time and time again. Other people have checked your work, so it's doubly checked. But the first flight to me always gives me butterflies. Restoring this aeroplane wasn't the most difficult one, because when we got it, it was a complete machine. What we had to do was refabricate it, go through all the woodwork on the wings, nice, bright, shiny, zero-timed engine. It's only done about 5 hours ground run testing, but as good as the day they built it 70 years ago. When you finally hand an aeroplane over to its new owner, you sometimes feel a bit sort of sad, because you've kind of sort of lost the baby, so to speak. Of course, there's a lot of excitement from the customer point of view when they're here and they see it being built, all the processes. And you feel kind of buoyed up by the fact that they're so excited about the thing being put together. And when we've test flown it and the new owner comes along and he's got it, either he flies it or somebody he knows will fly it away from here, that gives me another nervous moment, because how much time have they got on Stearmans or tail dragger aeroplanes, and it's their aeroplane, so it's up to them what they do with it. But it's always worrying that the guy might not have enough experience. But so far, touch wood, we've never had any incidents. Well, that Stearman used to fly many, many years ago when I took my first flight in it. But sadly, shortly after that it was grounded because it had a few problems, and the owner thought, well, it would be fun to take it all to pieces and rebuild it. 13 years on, sadly he died with nothing happening to the aeroplane, so it became available for purchase. And we had somebody who was very interested in having Stearman, so he did the negotiations with the widow, and we restored it, and now it's as beautiful as it ever was, and it's wonderful to see it back in the air. It's a sort of gut-wrenching sort of thing when you see them in the air. After all the hard labour you've put into restoring these, 70-year-old aeroplanes. But to see these old aeroplanes flying is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And to think that you've actually built or rebuilt them, and we've rebuilt several now, and it's a joy every time they take to the sky. They're just beautiful.